I think that there's been a lot of developments just in the last 3, 4 years that are very disturbing. So you have the rise of uh, what's been labeled populist nationalism, where you get democratically elected people like um, uh, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the Kaczynski in Poland, or Erdogan in Turkey. They use their democratic legitimacy on behalf of the quote unquote people. But in many cases, the people are not the whole people. It's a certain ethnicity. In fact, Viktor Orban said this explicitly in the case of Hungary, that Hungarian national identity is based on Hungarian ethnicity, which is fine, except that there's a lot of people who are not ethnic Hungarians in Hungary, and there's also a lot of ethnic Hungarians in all of the neighboring countries, in that part of Europe. And so it becomes very problematic. And if you remember, that's really the direct cause of the Second World War. That Adolf Hitler similarly said that Germany is just for ethnic Germans. And so I think that there's this idea that's come up in this populism, in this wave of populism, that we should retreat towards an older kind of understanding of identity that is based on ethnicity, race, religion. These are things you can't do anything about, as opposed to a true liberal order where it's open, to different cultures, to different people. Well, I think one of the drivers of this is economic. It really has to do with the nature of the global economy, because the global economy and the freedom of movement of goods, investment, people has been a boon. The liberal trade theory is not wrong. So everybody's gotten really, really rich as a result of this. But the problem is that not everybody in every country has gotten rich. And in particular, I think the old working class in developed countries has lost ground to a new rising middle class in places like China and India, Bangladesh, and so forth. And that's really the social basis, I think, of these reactive populist movements. These are Donald Trump's core supporters are these white working class people in the Midwest that have lost jobs in manufacturing, in coal, in a lot of traditional industries, and they're hurting. I mean, there's no question that this is a group that has not done well over the past generation, and so that's, I think, what's different about the current moment. I guess on your question of whether we're just facing a temporary setback or whether this is something much more fundamental, I guess I would argue that we shouldn't panic right now, because this is an adjustment. This is a kind of reaction on the part of people that have not done well, but it's a sector of the total economy that is actually in decline right now. It's being replaced by other people that live in more urban areas. They're better educated, that have better ways of taking advantage of globalization and the mobility that it provides. And so that's really the social cleavage. But I don't think it's one that necessarily will endure forever. I think that it depends a lot on the distribution of power in the international system. In that respect, China is going to be really important. The United States is really very busy retreating right now, pulling itself out of international agreements like the TPP and threatening other ones like NAFTA. And there's one country in the world that's prepared to fill that vacuum, very enthusiastically, which is China. And that is a world, they're not committed to the same liberal values that the United States has been, and so we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's going to be a great world. On the other hand, they do very much benefit from this liberal, rules-based order, and so, there's still some hope that they're not going to be trying to actively undermine it. That they want to maintain, the status quo that's benefited them. It's just that they want it to, they want to be the ones that are in charge. So that adjustment is going to be a really tricky one. Countries like the United States that are used to being the dominant power don't take to being displaced, all that graciously. Um, we'll have to see with China. I mean, one of the big, I think, early indicators is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because this is China's first effort to create a multilateral institution. And, so far I think the signs are okay, that they're not trying to wholesale replace the kind of rule-based system that governed the old world, with something completely different. Well, there's a lot of adjustments I think that can be made within existing liberal democracies to meet this challenge of, and I think it's primarily a cultural challenge that's posed by identity politics. Uh, Identity politics actually didn't start on the right; it started on the left because you had a whole series of social movements that swept the Western world. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, gay rights, rights of the disabled, indigenous peoples, all of these were very important issues of social justice because these were in fact groups that had been marginalized. But the way it evolved on the left was actually to return the world, in a sense, to this world of static identities where the way you were born defined your experience and kind of closed you off from sharing experiences with the rest of the society. And I think that the right has reacted to that. So 50 years ago in the United States or in Canada, white people didn't think of themselves as a discriminated group, as a minority that had grievances and was victimized. But now, so you Canadians are much nicer about this than Americans, but you hear this definitely in American politics now, that there's this sense of white grievance. And to some extent, you can understand, why people think this way, that you can have a Latino studies or a black, student union, but if you have a white student union, that's racist and, unacceptable. So that's not a good world to live in, where everybody is retreating into these ethnic and racial categories. And so I think that liberal democracies need to stress integrative forces that are still liberal. They need to stress identities, national identities, where people can share beliefs and liberal values, and communicate and be able to deliberate and so forth. That's a task that I think really leaders need to take up, in the democratic world right now. A lot of it is related to immigration and the way we think about immigration, and cultural change and so forth. Well, I think there's both good news and bad news. So if you look at who votes for populist parties across the developed world, there's a real age, a difference. The voters for Brexit, for Donald Trump, for a lot of the populist movements tend to be older voters. And so millennials are more tolerant. There's a lot of issues, race, ethnicity, gay rights. They're much more relaxed about all of those things. So in that sense, I think it's a positive development. I think that the core of the problem, though, is this amnesia issue that you alluded to. That I mean, I'm constantly amazed at my own students. So I've understood, for quite a while now that they didn't grow up like me during the Cold War, so they don't know what that was about. But, the students I have now, they didn't experience September 11th. They didn't experience, the Iraq War. I mean, all of these things that, shape my own understanding of the world are just not part of their experience. You take a country like Poland, where you had an entire generation that had grown up under communism, hated communism, was grateful for the opportunity to join the European Union, to become a full-fledged democracy. But that generation are now getting old, and young people in Poland had no experience of dictatorship. They don't know what it's like. They just see the annoying parts of living in the European Union, and so they're much more willing to, criticize it and think about alternatives. I'm not sure that this amnesia necessarily translates into support, however, for a real alternative to democracy. I think that it's guided more sort of by ignorance. It's not as if people are fed up with democracy and they want, a military dictatorship or something of that sort. That people get very fuzzy, when you ask them about what's the alternative if you don't like democracy. So in that sense, it's something that we should worry about, but I'm not sure that it poses, an immediate challenge.